corporate finance, creating forecasts is something we do constantly. But the truth is, most finance professionals are stuck using just one or two basic forecasting methods, leading to unreliable forecasts that executives simply don't trust. Now, as an FP&A leader with over a decade of experience training thousands of finance pros, I'm making this video to break down the 7 best forecasting techniques you need to master, explaining exactly when and how to use each one to drastically improve your forecast accuracy. Let's start with the first one, which is percentage adjustments. This is also called the incremental approach. This is the simplest method of all. You simply multiply prior year's figures by how much you expect them to grow or decline. So imagine you have your profit and loss statement, and then you have your financials by month. And then to come up with your forecast for the next year, you take each month's number for revenues, expenses, etc., and multiply it with, say, a 5% increase for revenues and a 3% increase for certain expenses. Now, let's take a look at the advantages and disadvantages of this method, because there are a few advantages and an even longer list of disadvantages to keep in mind. First of all, the advantage is that this method is simple and quick to implement. It's also simple to explain to people outside of finance. You don't need to have a degree in finance or accounting to understand that, well, if there's a 3% inflation on your marketing expenses, then you can expect this cost to increase by 3% in the future. Another advantage is that using this method, you can also account for seasonality if you already have an understanding of what that seasonality is, because you can take your actuals as a baseline. You can do that on a monthly or even more granular on a weekly or even daily basis, and then use that as the baseline for your forecast, which ensures that any seasonality that was already there in your actuals will also be included in your projections. Now, let's talk about the disadvantages. One, there is no forced analysis. It's a fairly shallow way of doing forecasting, right? You take your existing actual results and then you come up with a multiplication and a factor to drive this number. Now, to be clear, how you come up with this number, this percentage increase or decrease for your revenue and expenses, there can be a whole sophisticated process behind that. But even then, you're just taking your actuals as for granted, essentially. And you're not taking into account there could be one-offs that only occur once and shouldn't influence your forecasts. And you're also not taking a closer look at whether there are any expenses or revenue growth tactics that maybe didn't work as well as originally planned, that shouldn't be included in projections going forward. In short, because it is so simple, it's easy to brush over these important aspects that can actually have a big impact on your business. Secondly, using the incremental approach for forecasting expenses can create unwanted incentives. Consider this example. Your marketing team knows that you will forecast their budget for next year using the incremental method, meaning they will probably get a 4 or 5% increase in their budgets to account to inflation. They've known from experience that this is usually what they can expect. Now, the incentives you're creating is that this marketing manager will make sure to spend every last dollar by the end of the year, because if they spend less this year, then the basis for that 4 to 5% inflation increase for next year is lower, and they will also get less money next year. What that means is that they might be spending marketing dollars on lower ROI activities than they would have otherwise. What you want your leaders across the company to do is to flag when they can't spend the budget anymore at a high ROI and hand it back, so the company can reallocate the funds to higher ROI activities. But an incremental budgeting approach can incentivize the opposite. Now, even even though there are some significant disadvantages associated with the incremental approach, it still made it on the list of the 7 best forecasting techniques because it's fantastic in a very narrow but in a very specific set of circumstances, and that's when you need to forecast expenses with low strategic importance. Because the thing is, the other forecasting techniques that we discuss here have significant advantages, but they are also much more time consuming. So if time is of the essence, and if what you're forecasting is just a small part of the business, it's not strategic in nature, by all means use this technique. An example would be office supplies. Right? That's simply where you can take last year's spending, apply a 3% increase for inflation, and you're good to go. Next, we have driver-based forecasting, which is actually one of my absolute favorite forecasting techniques, as you will see. Here, each strategic business driver is mathematically tied to associated sales or costs. So you come up with a list of 10 to 15 drivers that influence your business, things that you might be doing differently, tactics that people across the company employ. And then you estimate the return on these of these drivers. So for example, you might be considering to increase the number of salespeople on your team. You have an associated increase of sales with that. Or you might invest more into marketing around your brand name. So when people come across your offers, they recognize the brand and everything the brand stands for. That's a bit more difficult to measure than hiring more salespeople, but it could also be an important business driver. And so you make your list, you estimate the impact on your results, and then you can also use this as a starting point for scenario planning. So for each business driver, you have a worst case scenario of its impact on the business. You have a base case and you have a best case scenario. And then you have a range of possible outcomes. And what this allows you to do is, let's say the base case for all your business drivers doesn't get you to the revenue forecast that you need to be at. And so then you have a discussion with the leadership team and you might say, well, we have good data on increasing salespeople. We have a good track record of attracting high performing salespeople. So for this business driver, we are happy to go with the best case scenario and we're willing to take that risk. Other common business drivers, so they're included here, are the number of your leads or any new features or products you roll out. Now, looking at the advantages, what I love about driver-based forecasting is that it enables and forces you to do a thorough analysis of what really matters. You can't throw 50 drivers on the sheet. That would be completely overkill and difficult to manage and wouldn't really get you there because you can't have proper discussions around it. You have to think about what are the 10 to 15 things that will really move the needle. And in doing so, you build your business understanding. You're getting closer to your cross-functional business partners, all of which is important for having a bigger impact as a finance leader. Driver-based forecasting also enables scenario planning, as we've discussed, which is a big advantage because scenario planning allows you to have a conversation around risk and also make sure that you put things into motion early when you realize that the upside, the best case, is particularly significant, for example. Furthermore, driver-based forecasting is a technique that remains useful throughout the year. Because let's say you refresh your forecast on a monthly basis. Every time you learn something new about one of the drivers of your driver-based forecast, you can tweak the model, you can update it, and so it becomes more and more accurate as you go through the year. It's a living and breathing document. But like any forecasting techniques, there are also a few disadvantages to consider. Number one is it requires deep business understanding. I mentioned that forcing you to do this analysis is an advantage, but if you're just getting started, or maybe you're new to the company and the business, then this might be something that, can hold you back and can make the process of building a driver-based forecast forecast quite time consuming because there are a lot of conversations you need to have, a lot you need to do to build that understanding. And there's also a risk of error stacking. What it means is that estimating the return on investment of each driver is often more an art than a science. And so with each line item, there's a margin of error. And if you have many drivers, then these margins for error add up. Sometimes if drivers are interrelated, then they can even multiply. But it's possible to work around that by making sure you're not including too many drivers. Overall, driver-based forecasting is fantastic for estimating revenue and having a collaborative forecasting process with the cross-functional team. I truly think driver-based forecasting is one of the best techniques out there. So I made a course about it, breaking down exactly how it works and how you can use it. I'm giving it away right now completely for free. So just click the first link in the description. You can get the course for free. Now, back to the video. Next on the list is expert judgment. This is where a subject matter expert provides their opinion on future developments. For example, a sales director might provide their assessment of which deals will close next quarter. This is a commonly used forecast technique that's often combined with other methods, and there are some clear advantages. Number one, it considers qualitative factors and context, which some other statistical methods don't do. It's also flexible and adapts to quickly changing environments, whereas again, statistical methods might put too much emphasis on recent data, and it incorporates nuances that the data alone doesn't capture. This is where the human ability of reading between the lines and connecting dots between disparate sources of information comes in. The disadvantages of an expert-led forecast is that, of course, we are all influenced by biases and emotions. There, you could also run into challenges where one expert says the opposite of what the other one says. So sometimes it is a bit subjective. And then you have to think about how do you weigh those reports. And then there's a risk of groupthink. What is groupthink? Groupthink means that if someone has an idea or an opinion in a group, and then everyone around the table agrees with that viewpoint, then people often quickly assume that this must be the best solution. But just because everyone agrees doesn't mean that there are other options that should be analyzed and considered. So when should you use expert judgment as a forecast technique? One, when you're dealing with experts that have a strong track record of high forecast accuracy. So it's very important that you track that over time and you look back at how forecast accuracy changed. And in areas where you don't have a lot of solid data, because then often expert judgment is the only way forward. In any case, if you use experts who give you input to your forecast, it's very important that you ask them questions when you get the numbers. You ask them about their methodology, you ask them which factors they considered, you ask them what gave them doubt, or a question I love asking is, how would you improve the accuracy of your projections if you had unlimited time and unlimited resources? The answers to that questions can often be quite insightful. The next forecasting technique on the list is zero-based budgeting. For this, you evaluate each expense line item or related groups and determine the ROI. You can do zero-based budgeting in two ways. You can either start completely from scratch and imagine like you're starting the company anew and think carefully which vendors and expense line items you want to include. This is the radical approach, and it does not work well if your business is bigger and more complex. In those situations, you can still do zero-based budgeting, but you would do it differently. Rather than starting from scratch, you take a close look at your existing expense items line by line and review whether you want to eliminate a line item or renegotiate the contract or keep it and perhaps even invest more in that area. Now, looking at pros and cons, zero-based budgeting is fantastic if you want to identify cost-saving opportunities because it forces you to question decisions that people made years ago. It helps you avoid the status quo bias, in other words, and it can help you discover the 20% of expenses that drive 80% of outcomes. This is important beyond just looking for cost-cutting opportunities, because once you've identified these 20% expenses that drive 80% of the sales, you can actually put fuel on the fire and focus more resources on them. Now, one of the major disadvantages of zero-based budgeting is that it can be quite time intensive. You need a cross-functional team to help you with this. Finance can't do it alone. And depending on how good your systems are, setting up the reports takes some time, and then reviewing whether each line item makes sense or not requires meetings and discussions. The second disadvantage is that there's a risk of rewarding short-term focus only. Because the thing is, if something has immediate returns, it's easier to justify than if an expense line item has returns that are far in the future, and you don't want to remove all your expenses that have a long-term focus. So where does that leave us? When should you use zero-based budgeting? Well, when there's a lot of pressure to identify cost savings, because then it's easy to get the cross-functional team aboard. And in areas of your business where it's relatively straightforward to connect expenses with their return on investment. For example, marketing expenses is often a good starting point. Next is time series analysis. This means you review historical actuals in detail to identify one-offs and trends, and then you apply what you've learned to future months. Let's take a look at an example. Imagine you work at a software as a service business, say Netflix, and you need to model sales. So you look at the marketing funnel starting from when someone visits the website, then they book a free trial, and then eventually they hopefully buy the product. And so you model out the funnel at these 3 points and review how conversion rates change over time and extrapolate trends from that. Now, the advantage is that the more often you do this, the faster it gets. It can be difficult for the first time, but if you do the same time series analysis every month, you only really need to look at the most recent data because you have already analyzed previous periods in earlier months. And the other advantage is that it's a combination between an expert judgment approach and an approach that relies on data. And so you have a bit of the best of both worlds there, as long as you make sure that you are indeed using primarily the data you have available to make your projections without putting too much in terms of assumptions into it, because then it can become a full-fledged expert judgment-based forecast. Now, there are some situations where this doesn't work, some disadvantages. It doesn't work well in new businesses simply because then often you don't have enough data available to do this properly. It can also amplify data quality issues, because if you have problems in your data that you're unaware of, it can lead to wrong projections. Obviously, this is a bit less of a problem than if you're using a full-fledged statistical model approach, as we'll discuss in a moment, because when you are reviewing the data yourself, you might be able to spot some of these data quality issues. But sometimes it can be difficult to identify one-offs without advanced statistical tools. This time series approach is best when you can isolate a single variable. In this case, in our example, it was purchases of the product, and then have the ability to break out one-time impacts that shouldn't influence your projections going forward. Now let's talk about statistical methods for forecasting. You have your simple and multiple linear regression techniques. You probably learned about those in in school. It's where you have a dependent variable and an independent variable, and one predicts the other. Then there are moving averages. That's where you calculate the average of data points in a specific period, or exponential smoothing techniques. Now it gets a bit more advanced. That's a statistical technique that places more weight on recent data points. Also commonly used in FP&A are ARIMA models. That's where you combine trends, seasonality, and error patterns. You can use some of these techniques in Excel, but to get to the more advanced and often also more useful techniques like ARIMA, you need a specialized tool or access to someone with data science skills. Now, the advantages of statistical methods are that they can be highly accurate in the short term with enough historical data, and also much faster to do than the other methods we mentioned, because once the model is set up, it's really just a press of the button and it creates a new scenario. But there are also some significant disadvantages. It requires a relatively stable environment. If there are a lot of changes to how customers find you, why customers buy your product, or the markets you serve, then this might not work well for you because it only takes historical data into account. It also really only works well for short and medium-term forecasts, because for longer-term forecasts, recent data just may not be adequate. You know, you might be approaching the business differently in a year from now than you do today, which doesn't get picked up by historical data. And statistical methods can be highly sensitive to data quality, meaning if you have some data issues, they get amplified, especially if they happened in more recent data. Now, when you use statistical methods, they can be fantastic if your business has a lot of data and in combination with other forecasting methods. In fact, when I worked at Squarespace, we tested this and we found that statistical methods combined with expert judgment have a better forecast accuracy than either statistical methods alone or expert judgment alone. And last on the list of the 7 best forecasting techniques is machine learning. This is where complex statistical models like neural networks or random forests extrapolate trends from historical data. These models are often so complex that even the data scientists who build them can't tell why your machine learning model gives you a certain projection. They're called black box models. But at the same time, they can be much more accurate than simpler models, and they have some other advantages as well. For example, you feed the model with data from 2 years ago, and then you ask it to predict last year's sales, and then you can immediately compare it to actual results to see how well the model does. In fact, data scientists use this backtesting technique to have multiple algorithms compete against each other, so you can use the most accurate one every time. Now, these work fantastic if you have vast amount of data, and they can identify patterns that humans and simpler algorithms might simply miss. They can also significantly save you time, and they can learn and become better and better if you feed it with more data and if you experiment with different data points and data series to feed it with. But the disadvantages are that they require technical expertise to implement. You need to work with a data scientist, or if you get an out-of-the-box solution, you need to be very careful with testing it for a period of time before you rely on the outputs. And because these are black box models, it can be difficult to answer questions around why is there still a variance? How do you explain the variance? You can't explain it based on how the machine works. You have to explain it based on what you're feeding the machine with, the data you're using to make projections. So when do you use a machine learning model? When you have large amounts of high quality data and you use it in combination with one of the other techniques, especially driver-based forecasting. It's a great combination with machine learning because they have almost opposite advantages and disadvantages. And there you have it. The 7 best forecasting methods for finance professionals. Now, in my experience training over 1,000 finance pros, I found that out of these 7, driver-based forecasting is the most powerful one that everyone needs to master. That's why I've created a free online course about driver-based forecasting and scenario planning that gives you everything you need to leverage these 2 techniques. To get instant access, just click the first link in the description. In this course, you'll learn everything you need to know to create efficient and accurate driver-based forecasts, how to use operational metrics to predict financial performance, how to give leadership concrete options for improving results, the difference between scenario planning and what-if analysis and when to use each, and a lot more. So again, click the link below to get the free course. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.